For 30 years, we trusted him with everything: our investments, our retirement accounts, our properties. He was more than our lawyer. He was family. Then one afternoon, while reviewing old financial documents in preparation for updating our will, I found a signature that didn't match. A small detail, an inconsistency that most people would have overlooked, but it was enough to make me start asking questions. And the more I dug, the more I realized that the man we'd trusted with our entire financial life had been systematically stealing from us for over a decade. What he didn't know was that my late father, a meticulous accountant who never threw anything away, had kept copies of every document, every statement, every transaction. The proof he thought he'd destroyed was sitting in a box in my garage. And by the time we finished, he didn't just lose his license. He lost everything. If this story helps you understand that trust must be verified, please like and subscribe. There are moments when a small inconsistency, something most people would dismiss as clerical error or oversight, becomes the thread that unravels years of carefully concealed fraud. When one signature that doesn't quite match or one number that seems slightly wrong creates doubt that leads to investigation that reveals comprehensive betrayal by someone you trusted completely. For my husband Robert and me, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while we were reviewing financial documents in preparation for updating our will, when I noticed that a signature on a property transfer document didn't match other signatures we had on file. When that small discrepancy made me start asking questions that would ultimately reveal that our lawyer of 30 years, a man we'd trusted with every aspect of our financial lives, had been systematically stealing from us for over a decade, had been forging signatures and manipulating accounts and creating false documents, while we'd remained completely unaware because we'd trusted him so completely that we'd never thought to verify what he was telling us or to independently review what he was doing with our money. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I'm 73 years old. My husband Robert is 75, retired engineer who'd built comfortable retirement savings through decades of careful work and prudent investing. Together, we had accumulated assets worth approximately $2.8 million, not extraordinarily wealthy by some standards, but more than sufficient to provide us with secure, comfortable retirement and to leave meaningful inheritance to our children and grandchildren. Our lawyer's name was Thomas Mitchell. We'd hired him 30 years earlier when we'd needed legal help with real estate transaction, had been impressed by his professionalism and his apparent expertise, had gradually expanded his role in our lives to include management of most of our financial and legal affairs. Over 3 decades, Thomas had handled our estate planning, our property transactions, our investment accounts, our tax filings. Essentially, every aspect of our financial lives had been under his oversight and management. The relationship had been built on complete trust. Thomas had been at family dinners and holiday celebrations, had been present for births of grandchildren and other significant family milestones, had positioned himself as more than just our lawyer, but as trusted family friend who genuinely cared about our well-being and our financial security. We'd never had reason to question his integrity or his management of our affairs. He'd always seemed competent and honest, had always been available when we'd needed help or advice, had always presented our financial situation in ways that seemed stable and well-managed. The discovery that would reveal Thomas's comprehensive fraud began with that small inconsistency in signature on property transfer document. Robert and I had been reviewing our documents in preparation for updating our will. We wanted to ensure everything was properly organized and that our estate plan reflected our current wishes about how our assets should be distributed after our deaths. As we'd been going through files of deeds and property records, I'd noticed that signature attributed to Robert on a property transfer from 8 years earlier didn't quite match his actual signature on other documents. The difference was subtle. The formation of certain letters was slightly different. The overall flow of the signature was somewhat off. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed or would have assumed it was just natural variation in how signatures look depending on circumstances of signing. But I'd been married to Robert for 50 years and had seen his signature thousands of times, and something about the signature on this property transfer document looked wrong enough to create doubt about whether Robert had actually signed it. When I'd shown the document to Robert and had asked if he remembered signing this particular property transfer, he'd looked confused and had said he didn't recall the transaction at all. The document indicated that we'd transferred partial ownership of one of our rental properties to a holding company, transaction that Robert had no memory of, and that seemed unusual given that we'd never done anything with holding companies before. We'd always owned our properties directly in our own names. The doubt created by this one inconsistent signature had led us to start reviewing other documents more carefully, looking for other irregularities or unfamiliar transactions. What we'd discovered over the following week of intensive review was a pattern of documents we'd apparently signed authorizing various financial transactions and property transfers that neither of us could remember, or that seemed inconsistent with our normal practices and preferences. Most significantly, we'd discovered that several of our investment accounts had been restructured in ways we hadn't authorized and that we couldn't understand. Funds had been moved from conservative retirement accounts into higher-risk investments managed by companies we'd never heard of. Substantial fees had been charged for investment management services we hadn't requested. Our overall account values seemed lower than they should have been given the market performance over the time periods in question. The accumulation of inconsistencies and unfamiliar transactions had created enough concern that we'd decided to consult with a forensic accountant, a financial investigator who specialized in uncovering fraud and financial crimes. We'd explained our concerns about the suspicious signatures and the unfamiliar transactions, had provided the accountant with copies of all our financial documents and records, had asked for comprehensive review of our financial situation to determine whether there was actually fraud occurring, or whether we were just confused elderly people misremembering transactions we'd actually authorized. The forensic accountant's investigation had taken 6 weeks and had been comprehensive and devastating in its findings. Thomas Mitchell had been stealing from us systematically for at least 12 years, had been forging our signatures on documents that authorized various financial transactions that benefited him or his associates, had been diverting funds from our accounts into investments that generated fees and commissions for him, had been manipulating our property holdings and our investment portfolios in ways that had cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars while enriching himself and hiding the theft, through false statements and misleading communications about our financial situation. The total amount Thomas had stolen was estimated to be approximately $470,000, substantial portion of our retirement savings that had been taken through years of small incremental thefts that individually hadn't been large enough to trigger our suspicion, but that had collectively represented massive betrayal and significant financial damage. The forensic accountant had also discovered that Thomas had been planning to continue and potentially escalate his theft. He'd been positioning himself to have even more control over our assets, had been encouraging us to grant him broader power of attorney that would have given him virtually unlimited access to our funds and properties. What Thomas hadn't known, what had ultimately provided the proof we needed to document his crimes and to pursue both criminal charges and civil recovery, was that my late father had been a meticulous accountant who had never thrown anything away, who had kept copies of every financial document and every statement and every transaction record from his entire adult life. When my father had died 15 years earlier and we'd inherited his house, we'd also inherited boxes and boxes of carefully organized financial records that he'd maintained. Among those records were copies of our own financial documents that my father had kept. He'd always asked for copies of our important papers so he could review them and provide advice. And he'd maintained his own files of our financial situation that he'd updated regularly based on information we'd shared with him about our investments and our properties. The copies my father had kept were independent verification of what our actual financial situation had been at various points over the past decades, were proof that couldn't have been manipulated by Thomas because Thomas had never known they existed or had access to them. When we'd compared my father's carefully maintained records of our finances with the statements and documents Thomas had been providing to us, the discrepancies had been obvious and damning. Properties that my father's records showed we owned free and clear were shown in Thomas's documents as having mortgages or encumbrances. Investment accounts that should have grown substantially based on market performance were shown as having much lower balances with large fees and poor returns. Transactions that my father had noted as one-time occurrences were shown in Thomas's records as having happened multiple times or in different amounts. Armed with the forensic accountant's findings and with my father's independent documentation of our actual financial history, we'd gone to the police and had filed criminal complaint against Thomas for fraud, forgery, and theft. We'd also filed complaint with the State Bar Association for ethical violations, and we'd retained criminal attorney to help us navigate the prosecution process and civil attorney to help us pursue recovery of the stolen funds. Thomas's initial response when confronted by police had been denial. He'd claimed that all transactions had been authorized, that any signatures were legitimate, that any apparent discrepancies were just accounting errors or misunderstandings. But when presented with evidence of forged signatures, with documentation of unauthorized transactions, with my father's independent records proving that Thomas's statements about our financial situation had been systematically false for years, Thomas's denials had become increasingly unsustainable. The criminal investigation had been thorough and had uncovered even more extensive fraud than we'd initially realized. Thomas had been stealing not just from us, but from multiple elderly clients, had developed sophisticated system for forging signatures and manipulating financial documents, had been using his position as trusted attorney to exploit vulnerable clients who trusted him completely and who didn't have the knowledge or the inclination to independently verify his management of their affairs. The criminal charges against Thomas had included multiple counts of fraud, forgery, theft, and elder financial abuse. The evidence had been overwhelming. The forged signatures that didn't match legitimate ones, the unauthorized transactions that had enriched Thomas at his client's expense, the false statements and misleading communications that had concealed his theft, the pattern of targeting elderly clients who were unlikely to discover or report his crimes. Thomas had ultimately pleaded guilty to avoid trial, had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for his crimes, had been permanently disbarred and could never practice law again, had been ordered to pay restitution to all his victims, though the practical reality was that he'd already spent most of the money he'd stolen and full recovery was unlikely. The civil proceedings to recover our stolen funds had been partially successful. We'd been able to recover approximately $180,000 through seizure of Thomas's remaining assets, and through claims against his malpractice insurance, and through settlements with some of the investment companies he'd used in his fraudulent schemes. It wasn't full recovery of everything he'd stolen, but it was a significant portion that would help restore some of what we'd lost. More importantly than the financial recovery was the validation that we'd been right to trust our instincts about the inconsistent signature, that the small discrepancy that had initially created doubt had ultimately revealed comprehensive fraud that might have continued indefinitely if we hadn't noticed it and investigated. The proof that my father's meticulous record-keeping had provided had been crucial to establishing the full scope of Thomas's theft and to ensuring he faced criminal prosecution rather than just civil liability. 5 years after discovering that one inconsistent signature that had led to uncovering Thomas's decade-long fraud against us, Robert and I are 78 and 80 respectively, living more carefully and more skeptically than we did when we'd trusted Thomas with everything. We'd learned painful lessons about the necessity of verifying even trusted advisors, about maintaining independent records and independent oversight of your financial affairs, about the reality that elder financial abuse is common and devastating, and often perpetrated by people who position themselves as trusted professionals or family friends. Our financial situation had been damaged by Thomas's theft, but hadn't been destroyed. We'd recovered enough to maintain comfortable retirement even if we had less than we would have had without his fraud. We'd been able to leave smaller but still meaningful inheritances to our children. We'd survived what could have been complete financial devastation if the theft had continued longer, or if we'd never discovered it. Thomas Mitchell, from what we know from prison records and from other victims who've stayed in contact, serves his sentence with no apparent remorse for what he did, apparently views himself as having been unfairly prosecuted for what he still characterizes as legitimate financial management, rather than acknowledging that he systematically stole from vulnerable elderly clients who'd trusted him completely. What I learned from noticing that one inconsistent signature and from the investigation it triggered is that trust must be verified. That even professionals with decades of apparent integrity can be systematically stealing while maintaining performance of trustworthiness. That small inconsistencies can be signs of larger fraud that deserves investigation rather than being dismissed as clerical errors or aging memory. My father's meticulous record-keeping, the boxes of carefully maintained copies of financial documents that I'd inherited and had almost thrown away multiple times, had ultimately provided the independent verification that made proving Thomas's fraud possible. The proof Thomas thought he'd destroyed, or that he'd assumed didn't exist, was sitting in a box in my garage, was evidence he'd never known about because he'd never imagined that someone was independently documenting our financial situation in ways he couldn't manipulate or control. That proof, combined with our willingness to investigate one small inconsistency rather than dismissing it, ensured that Thomas's fraud was exposed and prosecuted, and that he lost not just his license, but his freedom and his reputation, and everything he'd gained from years of stealing from people who'd trusted him. My name is Margaret Sullivan. Our lawyer stole nearly $500,000 from us over 12 years, forged signatures, manipulated accounts, and created false documents while positioning himself as trusted family friend who genuinely cared about our well-being. What he didn't know was that my late father had kept meticulous independent records of our finances. That one inconsistent signature would trigger investigation that would uncover the full scope of his fraud. That the proof he thought didn't exist would ultimately send him to prison and ensure he lost everything he'd gained from betraying the trust of vulnerable elderly clients. Trust must be verified. Small inconsistencies deserve investigation. And sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's the careful documentation that proves the truth when someone you trusted has been lying to you for years. Thank you for reading. If this story helps you understand that trust must be verified, please like and subscribe.